Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Her Song is a Sin, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lou1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Her Song is a Sin. Chapter 26. Scylla lifted her head from her pillow at the sound of a soft knock on the bedroom door. It was only around 9 in the morning, she saw as she glanced at the clock and her eyebrows furrowed. Tally and Rael weren't supposed to leave until the late afternoon, so who would be waking them up now? Rael was sound asleep, snoring softly in the bed. The bodyguard was the one usually up early and making her rounds of the house. At the least, she would be instantly alert at any noises or changes in the environment. That's when a knock sounded on the door a second time. Scylla was surprised by how Ray did not move in response to the noise at their door. Seeing how peaceful she was sleeping, Syl wanted her to get some rest. The musician untangled herself from the blonde and slipped into a long t-shirt and made her way to the door and opened it. She watched Tally's eyes widen as she took in her disheveled hair in state of undress. "What's wrong?" the musician asked. The redhead attempted to look beyond the brunette into the darkened bedroom. "Is Rael in there?" "Of course she is." Scylla squared her shoulders and leveled her chin. "She's exactly where she belongs." Tally nodded and shifted her stance away from Ray's direction and back to the musician. "We need to talk." Rael and... pointing to her sleeping girlfriend and with a confused face then pointed to herself. The musician was not expected to be included in Tally's request. "Yes, the both of you." Scylla nodded. "Okay, give us a minute." "I'll make coffee and I'll be in the sitting area." Scylla closed the door and turned back to the bed. She smiled, looking down at the bed and her lover, still sleeping soundly. She wasn't surprised. They'd been up most of the night, making love over and over again. They'd been insatiable, clinging to one another as if they might not get another chance. Scylla perched on the side of the bed and leaned over to gently kiss the blonde. She was surprised when she felt Rael's arm snake around her and pull the musician on top of her. "Good morning," Rael murmured in between kisses. Her hand slid over Scylla's body, caressing the soft skin. As a hand slipped beneath the hem of the shirt and between her thighs, Scylla moaned. The kisses deepened, and Rael began teasing her, and Scylla had to struggle to break away from the delicious sensations Rael's talented fingers were sending through her body. "Ray," she groaned, reaching to still her lover's hand. "Tally wants to see us." "She can wait," Rael said, moving her hands to slide the t-shirt up so she could take one of the brunette's nipples in her mouth. After a moment, Scylla shifted on the bed, and Rael moved enough to allow the brunette under the covers. Tally was on her second cup of coffee when Rael and Scylla emerged from the bedroom. They were dressed, but both still had that glow about them. An irritated Tally had to bite her tongue. "Good morning, Tal," Rael said, her voice chipper, as she dropped to the couch opposite the one where Tally had been sitting, and watching the horses from the large windows. "I'm afraid there's nothing good about it," Tally said. The glowing couple almost in unison broke from the blissful morning days in response to Tally's comment and focused on their reality. "What's happened?" Scylla asked, taking the space beside Rael on the couch. "Sarah called this morning. They finished rerunning the forensics." "What did they find?" Tally looked at her friend and then at the musician. She knew the news she had wouldn't please either of them. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but they found a fingerprint on one of the dolls. They used the partials from the pond incident as a reference. It was Helen Graves' print. No, Scylla said immediately. It couldn't be. Wait, Tell, it was just a partial. Brielle was already starting her own protest, convinced that she had the right target in her sights by wanting to hunt down Alban Hurst. So what? How can it be conclusive? That's great you found a partial, but multiple people could have touched the dolls before they got to you. Helen drove. She helped Porter out with security. Tally was already shaking her head sympathetically. They found this print on the inside of the doll, the joint where the head attaches. Brielle just frowned, mulling the new information around in her head, but beside her, Scylla was still making protests. If you're saying that Helen did this, then you're wrong. There's just no way. Sarah is getting a team together as we speak. They are going to go in tonight. We need to get her while we have the element of surprise. She didn't do this, Scylla repeated, shaking her head and swinging her arm in one swift motion across her body, as if she was casting a spell to convince them that it wasn't Helen. Miss Graves does have a criminal record, Tally said. Drugs, Scylla said with a scoff. Sure, I know, but that's not... She isn't capable of doing what happened on that video. There has to be some mistake, some explanation for this. Let me talk to her. Raelle looked at her lover and then at her friend and shrugged. I don't know, Tell. Helen has a dark side, but murder? Her prince. I know, Raelle answered. Maybe Scylla is right. We should all go back. Scylla can speak with her. Telly's eyes widened in alarm. There's no way Sarah would allow that. Why not? Raelle asked. If Alder is right on this and Helen's the killer, then she's fooled everyone for a very long time. Even me, Tell. The redhead met the ice-blue eyes of her friends and nodded. You think Scylla could get a confession? If there is one, Raelle said, still not completely willing to give up her own theory. There isn't, Scylla insisted. Tally looked between the two for a moment and then nodded. Okay then, if I'm taking this to Sarah, let's get a plan ready. How do you want to do this? We fly back and meet Alder. We still follow her plan to obtain Helen. I'll meet Alder at whatever staging point she has set up. Then we go in and secure Helen. Only thing I'm requesting is that after she's in custody, Scylla can meet with her. Tally bit her lip as Raelle talked. She knew Sarah wouldn't like it, but she thought she could sell it to her partner. Okay, the redhead agreed with a nod. I'll give her a call. As Tally stood up and took out her cell phone, Raelle stopped her with a wave of her hand. Tal, what about Hurst? Dead, Tally answered with a frown. Sorry, Raelle, I know you thought it was him. The blonde shook her head and sighed. Yeah, well, even I'm wrong now and again. I don't know who's doing this, but it's not Helen. Rielle's eyes met the musician's and she spoke. I don't want to believe it either, but if they found a print and Hurst is dead, what other option is there? Tally looked at the lovers another moment and then stepped away to call Sarah. Raelle was doubtful, and Scylla had been resolute about Helen's potential to commit the crime. But for some strange reason, neither Byron nor Porter seemed to be surprised by the news. Instead, they both shook their heads and agreed they should get back home to get things resolved. Raelle was only surprised to discover that Scylla and the boys had already packed their things, and were ready to leave with the bodyguard, despite her plea for them to stay behind. They had the sense to look sheepish as they walked out of their rooms with their bags packed, but Scylla met her lover's icy eyes with a look of defiance. I told you, I go where you go, Scylla said simply as she moved around Raelle to put her bag in the trunk of the waiting car. Raelle stared at her lover for a moment and then nodded as she walked over to the car with her bags and put them beside the musician's luggage in the trunk. Edwin Collar stepped off of the porch and made his way to the car. He was helping Quinn out by also driving to the airfield so that there would be enough room for everyone and all of the luggage. Plus, he wanted a few extra moments with his daughter. He met her just before she opened the back door and gave her a hug. Thanks, Dad, Raelle said, returning her father's hug. She breathed in his aftershave and then sighed deeply as she reluctantly let him go. No trouble, kiddo, Edwin replied, meeting his daughter's gaze. And don't you get yourself in any trouble. Raelle nodded and forced a smile but didn't respond. She wouldn't lie to her father, and she still wasn't convinced that the resolution to everything that had happened would be as simple as arresting Helen Graves. She had that feeling that something bad was going to happen, and she knew she'd do whatever was necessary to protect her client, her love. She would take a bullet herself to save Scylla. Edwin frowned, reading his daughter's mind. Please be careful. I want you and that girl back here for Christmas, okay? Riel smiled. She saw Telly gesturing at the watch on her hand as she emerged from the house and opened the car door. Looking back at her dad, she said, We'll be back for the holidays, I promise. After Riel got in the car beside Scylla in the back and Telly hopped in the front, Edwin took his place behind the wheel and waited for Quinn to pull out of the drive in her truck. As soon as her truck turned down the road, Edwin followed. Theo had dumped his work bag on the couch as soon as he had got home from the Ramshorns' estate the day before. Being in the very witch's lair had filled him with even more hate, and the desire to kill Scylla Ramshorn and her entire coven was stronger than ever. Yet, he needed to wait. There was a need or curiosity to see where it had happened all those years ago, to lay his eyes upon the place that took his family and had it turned upside down. He needed to see where his brother had been killed by the witch. He had seen the painting, the image of his brother on the swing at the pond. His brother's death had given the witch her power. Then, soon after she had become famous, his father became sick and weak from grief and the alcohol that he consumed. She rose as his family fell. His father believed her pact with the devil allowed the very life force of their family to be siphoned to hers, like a cosmic succubus or vampire. It had been decided. It would only be fitting to leave the witch's next gift at the pond where it had all begun. Like the Holy Trinity, the act would serve three purposes. First, it would leave no doubt in the witch and her coven's mind as to who was doing this. Scylla would know who was coming for her. Second, she would learn about the sacrifice, and she would come out of hiding long enough to bury her dead loyal coven member, and he would be waiting. Third, and most importantly to his father, by making the sacrifice where it had all started, he would be gifted the power needed to finish the witch. God would grant him the same power the devil had gifted to the witch. He would at last break the spell and reclaim his family's power, and then his brother and father could rest in peace. Theo glanced at the time. He only had a couple of hours before he was scheduled to be at the Ramshorns' estate. Yes, the job was supposed to be on the car, but there was a bigger job he needed to complete. He repacked the bag, ensuring he had everything that would be needed. Of course he had to double-check that there was duct tape, rope, and his gun. With some last-minute additions and a couple other things he remembered, Theo stuffed his gloves in his coat pocket. Now, he was ready. Inside him, he felt his father's anticipation build. Arriving early, with hardly any traffic, probably due to the pending storm they were forecasting, the mechanic pulled up to the gate of the mansion. Theo smiled as the window in the security booth opened. "Can I help you?" the guard asked, glancing from the man in the car and back to the game that was playing on the little television in the booth. It should have shown feed from the security cameras surrounding the property, but it was obvious that while the cat's away, the mice played. "Yes. Miss Graves is expecting me? I'm working on the Porsche." The guard nodded, barely paying the man any attention. Yesterday, Helen had told him to make himself scarce because she had a client coming by. Per usual, the deal was a few samples of what she had been growing in the hothouse, and in turn would make him take a well-timed break. He was supposed to do the same thing today, but apparently someone had got the time screwed up. Still, the drugs she served were good enough. He could just forget to put a note in the visitor log. It wouldn't be the first time Helen would have to make good on the mistake later. "Sure, go on in. Want me to call Helen? I think she's still making her rounds." "No, that's all right," Theo said. "I'll just start working on the car. I'm sure she'll be along soon enough." The guard nodded and started to punch a button on the keypad, but then stopped and took a closer look at the mechanic. There was something off about this guy, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was that disturbed him. "The garage will be locked, so maybe I should call Helen," the guard said as he reached for a two-way radio receiver. "Hey!" Theo barked, loud enough that the guard paused with the two-way radio halfway up to his face. "I gotta ask, isn't the place in Byron Ramshorn's masterpiece painting that's gotten all the buzz somewhere around here?" The guard frowned again but nodded. "Yeah, it's around the back side of the property. That's where Helen's probably finishing her rounds." Theo grinned. "Well, that's great. I'd love to see it in person. How about you giving me directions and I'll just go meet her out there?" "I'm not sure that's a great idea," the guard said, shaking his head. The head of security said I'm not supposed to let... Who's gonna know? Theo asked with a conspiratorial smile gracing his face. Helen's already expecting me, and I'm sure you know about our little arrangement. This way I can really keep out of sight. Hell, I'll even tell her it was your idea. I bet she'll give you an extra thank you. The guard thought for a moment. The mechanic had a point. That nosy manager, Isadora, was still on the property, and she could be a real bitch. If she caught wind that Helen was still doing her little side projects and that he'd helped, it would be goodbye, George. Putting the radio down, he reached for a scrap piece of paper and a pen. You just gotta get back on the road and follow it for about a mile. The turn-off is on your right. The road isn't marked, but you'll notice a break in the trees. As the guard spoke, he started to draw a crude map of the area, and Theo listened attentively to each direction. About 10 yards in, you'll come to a gate. There's just a camera there and a keypad, but if you wave, I'll open the gate remotely from here. It's a dirt road, but it eventually comes to a dead end. It would indeed, Theo thought with a small smile. So just park your car in the grass. You walk across a little clearing and then a grove of trees. On the other side is where you'll find the old pond. And I'll find Helen there too, Theo asked. You'll see the side-by-side, George said, and he handed the map to the mechanic. Just be sure to close the gate and tell her I said hello. Theo nodded. I'll be sure to let her know how much you helped. As the little TV crackled in the booth with the roar of fans' applause, George turned his attention back to the game. With the satisfaction that even if his team lost, there was still going to be a party. He'd score big with his girlfriend when he showed up at her place with Helen's special blend. Theo backed his car enough to manage to swing a 180 and turn it back onto the road. He grinned as he clutched the steering wheel with one hand and the little map with the other. He chuckled as he read the guard's scrawl, "Dead End, Park Here," on the map. Inside her workshop, Helen scrutinized the doll, turning it this way and that with a gloved hand. She grinned, thinking that all in all she'd captured the likeness of the bitch bodyguard pretty well. Carefully, she attached a little mini pancake holster to the belt around the doll's waist. She had just reached for the toy gun when her phone chimed beside her. Brow furrowed, she carefully put the doll down on the workbench and reached for her phone. Her eyes widened at the alert she read, and she quickly opened the app to see the mechanic staring at her. She almost dropped the phone, but caught it by the pop socket. Horrified, she watched Theo staring directly into the camera lens at the tree by the pond. Slowly, almost deliberately, he turned away and began heading directly towards the hothouses. Helen jumped up from her chair and made her way up the narrow steps. She slammed the trap door, but didn't bother with locking it or moving the rubber mats back in place. She didn't have time to do that before he'd reach her. What the hell was he doing here on this part of the property anyway? Theo stopped his approach as Helen stepped out of what appeared to be an old abandoned hothouse, but he knew otherwise. He had heard the sound of a nearby generator, and Helen wasn't dressed nearly warm enough for the cold. Is this where you grow your stuff? Theo asked, wanting Helen to get closer to him. Yeah, Helen answered cautiously, pausing mid-stride. What are you doing out here? Theo shrugged and smiled. I got done early at the shop and thought I'd come on over and get started, but the guard said the garage was locked, so I decided to take a little stroll and find you. How'd you know I'd be here? Theo shrugged again. The guy at the gate told me you were on the grounds. In truth, Theo had hoped to come out to the pond and have time to himself with his father and his brother before tracking the sacrifice down. He had prayers that must be said to sanctify the sullied grounds. Obviously, the camera must have alerted her to his presence, and now he would have to improvise. Helen's face scrunched in confusion, and she took a step back. But how did you even know about this place? Theo laughed and smiled as he casually strode forward, closing the distance she'd created. Well, I have to confess, I love Byron Ramshorn's art. This is the place he painted, right? I read about it online, and then the guard, George, right? Yeah, he confirmed it. Helen stared at the mechanic, uncertain. She guessed it could be true. She knew about the painting and the uproar after the gallery opening. Regardless, she didn't want him so close to her little hideaway, and even though she didn't want to get any closer to the mechanic, she took another step on the path towards him to keep him from getting any closer to her sanctuary. Helen, her voice a little stutter, answered. Yeah, but Byron is pretty great at painting. Don't tell him I said that. I won't hear the last of it. Seeing Theo with his feet still planted, she walked around him, giving him a wide berth while attempting to lead him back towards the garage. As she walked away in the direction where the side-by-side was parked, hoping he would follow, she continued. I believe this was a scene in that painting. If you like, there's more of his work inside the house I can let you see. Theo knew what the minion was trying to do, to lead him from this unholy place of power. He grinned, though his voice was flat as he spoke. Yeah, who was the kid in the painting? Most of his artwork is from someone in his life. He normally does portraits, right? I recognize Scylla in a few. So who was the boy? Helen stopped in her tracks and turned back around to look at Theo. That's an odd question. Aren't you just a mechanic? She blushed, realizing she'd probably just insulted this strange man she was alone with in the woods. She chuckled, trying to lighten the very dark mood she felt. Theo, man, I'm not an artist either. As you can see by the car you are fixing, my concern is the automobiles and greenery. I don't know what was going on in Byron's mind. Well, it looked like you and a couple of other people were also in the painting, in the reflections in the water. I could vaguely make out some faces. One had your hair color and everyone looked about the same age. Worried about how in-depth the questions were getting and seeing him still not moving from the spot closer to the hothouse, Helen reached for her phone in her pocket, but remembered she dropped it when she hurried to shut the trap door and get outside. The groundskeeper looked behind Theo and saw a reflection of her screen where it lay in the grass close to the door of the hothouse. Shit. Yeah? Oh, I think I know which one you're talking about. Like I said, I don't know every one of his artworks. That was a boy from when we were kids. We all grew up together, and he took his life. The kid was sad. The whole thing was crazy for us. His name was Clay. His father was nuts before, and then he went batshit after. Not sure what happened to his brother Max. Poor kid. To grow up with a fucked up dad like that? Dude, this is hell depressing. Helen stopped talking, realizing that she'd been babbling. She could sense she was quickly losing control of the situation. Shifting her shoulders back, she made an attempt to reestablish it. Hey, since we're here, let's grab some mushrooms from the road before we get back to the garage. She backtracked towards her phone while picking up some stray mushrooms. He still wasn't moving, and she had to get to her phone. That batch there's pretty damn good, Helen said, gesturing at the ground. Some of my best. That's a quoted review from my last customer who tried them. I need to create a Yelp page, Helen said with a forced laugh, hoping Theo would turn his back to pick some mushrooms. He didn't budge, just glanced down at the mushrooms and then back to Helen with a grin. He's not leaving, she realized. She suddenly understood why the guys at the audio shop didn't like the dude. There was something seriously off about him. She just needed him distracted long enough to get to her phone and call for help. Looking back towards Theo, still sporting that odd smile, with the tree in the background, memories of Clay flashed through her mind. You know, now that I'm thinking about him, it's crazy, Theo, of how you remind me a lot of him. Yeah? Huh. How strange. The mechanic kept his hands inside his pockets while he listened to the minion babble. He had all of his fun tools still in his bag, but it was back in the car. He hadn't expected the groundkeeper all the way out here. He did have a 3-inch spring-loaded Benchmade knife in his left pocket, and the shop plastic bag in the other, though. Theo thought that it was a good thing that it was a shop bag. They were good quality, thick, and resistant to tears. He always had one in his coveralls for his oil rags or messy tools. Eeny, meeny, miny, moe. Oh, Father would be furious with me. To start without the proper prayer first? The lamb had practically wandered to the slaughter of her own accord, or was it divine intervention? Was the sacrifice already blessed? Well, you're going to be working here. I don't even know your full name, Helen said, holding up her hand, and she waited for Theo's response. Well, Theo is actually my middle name. What? That's cool. Helen felt as if she had to say something. Theo had such an empty glare as he spoke. The groundskeeper had seen her fair share of wild personalities. The man before her, made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. In a voice reminiscent of Clay's father's, Theo's demeanor changed as he spoke. "You know my name, demon. Stop your lies. That's all you know. You can't lie to God's soldiers." Helen's jaw dropped at the sudden change in the mechanic's demeanor, and it took everything in her to keep standing there. This guy had some serious problems. She was about to respond when the man shook his head, then swiped at his face, almost like he was trying to swat at an annoying insect. His expression stiffened, and then his smile returned. "My first name is Maxwell, middle name Theodore," Theo said, taking another step closer towards Helen. "Oh my goddess." Helen took a step back, hearing the name Maxwell, seeing his face, at the pond, the look in his eyes. The groundskeeper tried to hide the fear that swept over her. She knew who this man was. Maxwell. Max. "Hurst," the mechanic said, completing her thought. He saw the fear etch in her face, and it filled him with excitement. To see the witch's minion in fear gave him power. Helen was overwhelmed by the need to get to the phone to get help. She was all alone and the phone was out of her reach. Damn it! Theo took another step closer, and then another. Helen reacted with a swift front kick to Theo's nuts. Her kick was with such force it knocked her backwards off her feet. He was late at reacting, though, and he felt the jolt of pain in his groin. It surged through his body, stunning him as much as it enraged him. Helen knew it would only buy her a few precious seconds to get away. Maybe just enough time for her to sprint to the phone, and maybe even the trap door. Theo hunched over in pain, wheezing and attempting to keep himself from being sick. But the anger, his mission, his father brought him back. "Get up now and get her!" His eyes locked on Helen bear-crawling, not towards the house, but back where she came from earlier. The mechanic moved with the speed of a cheetah attacking its prey. He caught up to her with ease, grabbing her ankle, then the other. The mechanic's grip was strong and firm. Helen's petite frame was not much of a challenge for Theo as he jerked her back, her body laying flat as she slid on the ground towards the mechanic. He got down on top of her, knee digging into the small of her back. "I guess we are picking the bag, Helen?" Before the redhead could even comprehend what was going on, she heard plastic rustle, and in a split second, a flash of white went over her eyes. As Theo put the plastic bag over her head, she felt a tightness around her neck. Her vision was blurred and her breathing was restricted. The plastic was pushed against her face. Every breath was obstructed by the bag sealing her mouth. She could only hear her gasps and the plastic. She fought, trying to get Theo's hands to loosen their grip. Nothing. She was now only inhaling the bag. No air. Fatigue was setting in. It was Clay's brother this whole time? Why me? Am I going to die? I can't die. Helen's arms went limp, and she stopped struggling. Theo loosened up his grip. He didn't want her dead just yet. He stood up, leaving the groundskeeper unconscious on the dirt path, and stood over his prize. His work had just begun. Tally arranged for a pickup when they landed at the airfield, and Scylla thought that the agent who arrived to collect them looked like the cookie-cutter FBI agent of a TV drama. The redhead had introduced him as Agent Black. After providing them the news of a freak storm front that had already begun dropping freezing rain and snow in the area, he helped them gather their things without much discussion and ushered them into the vehicle. After they had been on the slick roads for a few minutes, Scylla heard a radio crackle to life. Sitting in the back row, she struggled to make out bits and pieces of the exchange between Agent Black and Agent Alder. Her voice sounded commanding and intimidating, even over the crackle of the radio. He updated her that they were less than 15 minutes from the rendezvous, but warned that with the worsening roads it might take longer. The musician still couldn't believe Helen could be behind any of this. The sound of Agent Black threw her away from her thoughts. "Can't figure you out, Red," Black said, eyes darting from the road to the rearview mirror to look at Tally in the second row of the SUV. "Are you one of us, or not?" Tally's mouth stretched into a thin line as the SUV slid a bit and shot Agent Black a pointed look before she nodded her head and responded. "You mean human? Yes, I'm with you now. We'll see what happens after." Scylla listened to the exchange between the agents with a frown. She knew she'd caused the redhead a lot of grief, and she regretted it. Rael's friend had been nothing but kind to her. The redhead even took up for her, and Rael with Alder on the phone earlier when the special agent in charge had first declined Rael's offer to help with the arrest, and Scylla's insistence at being on site to speak with Helen. Scylla sighed, wondering how she could make things right with Tally. She felt her arm being squeezed, and she glanced at Rael, who had an arm around her and had pulled her in closer. "Stop overthinking things. It will all work out in the end," Rael said softly, whispering into the brunette's ear. As the SUV traveled along the slippery Massachusetts roads towards the staging area, Scylla could only hope she was right. The vehicle turned into the parking lot of the local police station, and Scylla stiffened. She could feel the tension from Porter and Byron too, and she met Rael's concerned gaze with a quirked brow. The three of them stood still. This was the same station from when they were kids. One would think it wouldn't look as intimidating as adults. To those three, the building looked like it had grown in size. Ray reached for the musician's hand with a gentle tug, breaking her trance on the building. "It's okay. We'll meet Alder here and go to the mansion with the team," Rael said softly, answering the musician's unasked question. She continued to give reassuring smiles to the musician as they walked with Byron and Porter in tow. The bodyguard knew that the Ramshorn's previous experiences with law enforcement hadn't been pleasant, and she was sure it was uncomfortable for them to be around so many police now. Still, this was the staging area Agent Alder had picked. A young woman in uniform met with them at the side entrance near where Agent Black had parked. She quickly ushered them inside the police station and toward a small conference room at the end of a pale green tile hall. Around them were officers, some in uniform and some not, milled about. More than one shot a curious look at the group and especially at Scylla Ramshorn. The sight of a couple officers dressed in tactical gear was encouraging to Rael, though she felt Scylla falter beside her. The bodyguard would have reassured the musician, but the officer stopped at the closed door and opened it for the group. Tally, who had taken the lead, smiled at the officer and thanked her as she went inside. Once everyone was inside and the door had been shut again, Special Agent Sarah Alder looked up from the maps and schematics spread out on a chipped formica conference table with a scowl. The smell of burnt coffee was faint in the air, and around her was more than one rumpled-looking agent. "Problems?" Rael asked, not waiting for pleasant introductions. "The surveillance team cannot seem to locate our target," Alder said, glaring at one of the more rumpled agents who ducked his head. Another agent beside him looked up as sort of a replacement for the line of questioning. Her clothes were just as rumpled, but whereas her partner looked defeated, she still seemed hopeful. "We know she's on the property, we just don't know where." "How can you be sure she's on the property, Agent?" "Taurus," the woman answered, turning to Rael, who'd asked the question. "We've had surveillance on the mansion ever since the incident at Fort Salem." Scylla and Byron looked at one another with frowns but didn't speak. Alder caught the exchange. "I'm sure you wanted protective eyes on the rest of your crew. Although you have always been the primary target of these attacks, we felt the need to provide those closest to you with a certain amount of protection." And scrutiny, Scylla thought. After a moment, though, the musician nodded. "Yes. Thank you, Agent Alder." Telly looked at Rael and then back at Alder. "So we are absolutely certain that Helen Graves is on the property?" "Yes," Taurus answered. "However, we haven't had eyes on her since early afternoon," Alder groused. "Cameras?" Rael asked. Taurus shook her head. The defeated-looking agent beside her finally raised his head. "No dice." Rael thought for a moment and then spoke. "Well, the cameras don't provide total coverage of the property. That was something I haven't gotten the chance to fix. Primarily, I had them set up for the entrances, weak areas, and the perimeter where someone could get in, and entry points to the main house itself. I mean, there are blind spots." Taurus nodded. "We've had drones over the property as well." "And you still can't find her?" Tally asked. "No," Agent Alder said, the frustration in that single-word response evident. "Have you tried using infrared?" Rael asked, speaking directly to Agent Taurus. Scylla had her attention on Agent Alder, though, and spoke up. "Let me call her." "Absolutely not," Alder said. The tone of her voice stopped the various side conversations going on between different agents and the local law enforcement in the room, and all eyes turned towards the musician and the agent in charge. And why not? You could alert her to what we're doing, and she could run. I cannot let you jeopardize this mission. Being too close to the target makes you a liability. If Miss Ramshorn calls, it could flush her out and give us what we need to pinpoint her, Taurus reasoned. I don't want her hurt, Scylla said as she glanced at an officer in relaxed tactical gear. Byron and Porter jerked their heads up and looked at Scylla, but didn't comment. Miss Ramshorn, Alder said, I don't think you understand. She's the primary suspect in multiple killings. I will not allow you to call her or contact her in any way, Agent Alder said with an air of finality. Scylla was about to protest, but Raelle touched her arm gently and gave the slightest shake of her head. Alder wasn't paying attention as she was already looking around at the other members of the team. Time is growing short and our window is closing. I want to apprehend Miss Graves and have her back here before the storm gets any worse. Yeah, good luck finding her without me, Scylla said as she pulled away from Raelle's grip and stepped up to the table across from Agent Alder. Excuse me, Miss Ramshorn? Look, my property is huge. With the storm, most of the paths are going to be covered. Helen only clears them if I'm on the property. Let me call her. You can use her cell phone to track her. Taurus thinks it could work. I don't think you understand. If she thinks I'm coming, she'll be busy cleaning the driveway and the walkway. She's always been like that, a teenager cleaning the house after being alone. Then you can do your thing with no one getting hurt. Agent Alder frowned and Scylla saw a weak spot forming in his senior agent's steely resolve. She continued to make her argument. Your agents, they'll get lost. Your team is trained, but celebrities are skilled at privacy when it comes to possible aerial shots. I know you haven't gotten a proper view of the landscape, and I can tell you these schematics are out of date. Raelle, having extensively studied the most recent blueprints of the property, for when she'd had the security cameras installed, walked up to the table beside Scylla and studied the maps and drawings. After a few seconds, she nodded and looked up at Alder. She's right. This is old. There's a lot more paths here and here. I can give you an accurate update since it's been a while being back there. She spoke. She gestured to the maps. The worst part, though, is this part is way overgrown. That I know for sure. You can only traverse it on foot. Alder's jaw clenched, and she was about to object again when Tally spoke up. Sarah. The senior agent jerked her head towards her lover with a glare, but it was evident that Tally didn't plan to heed the warning. And why would she? By now, everyone had already figured out that they were a couple. She'd left the field office just so they could be public. Why pretend otherwise now? Yes, Tally, Alder said, also dropping the formality for a moment. Scylla's here. She's willing to cooperate, ready to help. It's her property. She knows it better than any of us. But if she tips off Miss Graves... She won't. Tally looked at Scylla and shot her an expectant look. You won't, will you? No, Scylla answered, though she regretted saying it. She felt like she was betraying her friend. But maybe she was also saving her from harm if the whole thing turned into an FBI raid gone wrong. There, Tally said, voice chipper. Raelle trusts Scylla, and I do too. I vote we let Scylla make the call. So do I. Me too, the defeated male agent said, eyes now shining with new hope. Beside him, Taurus nodded. Sarah slowly gave a single nod of consent. Okay. When you call, you would simply say that you have decided to come back, that you tried to call earlier but had difficulty due to the storms. This will be on speaker, Miss Ramshorn. Scylla nodded and pulled out her phone. As she put the phone on speaker and dialed, she felt the others in the room press in on her, wanting to hear the exchange. Hello, this is Helen. You know what to do. Scylla didn't know what to do, though. She couldn't recall a time that Helen hadn't answered her call. As the beep signaled for her to leave a message, she ended the call and looked up at Agent Alder. The senior agent was studying the expression on Scylla's face carefully. You seemed surprised. She always answers, Scylla said. Maybe she's in the shower, Raelle suggested. Looking at the others, she added, could the surveillance team have missed something and she's just holed up in her apartment? Or maybe she's out clearing the driveway with the plow, Byron suggested. You have a plow? Alder asked. Well, it's an attachment for the side-by-side. Got a snowblower, too, Porter answered, remembering lugging it around in the winter. She could be out clearing snow. No, Taurus said, shaking her head. One of the drones would have seen that. Well, what do we do now? Rael asked. Theo watched the redhead. She wasn't waking up as quickly as he'd hoped she would. He would have preferred her to wake up while he was still completing his message, but the groundskeeper didn't even flutter an eyelid. He briefly wondered if he'd overdosed her. Then again, she'd probably already been on something before he got to her anyway. Her phone, that he had found and placed on the workbench, lit up and began to vibrate. The small space was filled with the ringtone, and he laughed at the lyrics he heard. I'll let you whip me if I misbehave. It's just that no one makes me feel this way. The sound of the ringtone roused Helen. The first sensation that she felt was agony. Pain seared from her chest and her head pounded. She tried to move but realized her arms were tied to a chair. Her head was foggy and she shook it, trying to clear it. Her eyes focused on her arms and tied wrists. What the fuck is this? She struggled against the bonds and the pain seared in her chest again. She felt a wetness, a stickiness on her chest. There was a coppery scent in the air. She was trying to figure out what had happened when she was startled by the mechanic. Hello, Miss Graves. I was getting bored with you asleep. Theo walked over to the woman and roughly grabbed her by the chin to raise her head. Say hi to the camera. Oh, and you have a missed call. Though I suppose you know that since that's what finally roused you. How sweet that you woke up for Silas' call. It's a shame you missed it. The groundskeeper, forced to look up, recognized her workshop. Holy hell. He found it, but how? I left it uncovered. Damn. Where's my phone? I heard it. It was on the ground last time. Oh no. Jerking her head to the side, she screamed, What the fuck, Theo? Let me go! After a moment of useless struggling, she tried to speak again, attempting to hide the shake in her voice. Maybe she could find a way to reason with him. Why are you doing this? I wasn't even close with your brother. Helen, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You cannot have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons. Corinthians 10:21. What is that supposed to mean, you psycho? The groundskeeper snapped back. Psycho. Seeing your lovely little hobbit hole with your toy dolls is great something for you to call me psycho. Theo laughed as he gestured around the little underground room with a large serrated knife that was smeared with blood. As he gestured, blood droplets spattered onto the floor and onto him. The mechanic had a different pair of coveralls on, and Helen saw that they were covered in blood. Blood. There's so much blood. Helen looked down at her chest, remembering the sticky wetness she felt on her shirt. The longer she stayed awake, it seemed the pain had started to become more defined. She looked down at her chest. Even with the words upside down and backwards, she recognized the word bitchy carved into her flesh. As Helen took in the reality of the situation, Theo continued to rifle through the things on her desk. With a laugh, he picked up one of the dolls and held it up in the air. Looks like we have another artist here. Is this the bodyguard? It's really close to her likeness. Shame on that one. She had potential. After looking at a few other things on her work table, he turned his full attention to her. Helen looked at the mechanic warily and then glanced over to where Theo had pointed to earlier and seemed to be focused on now, and saw that there was a camera recording. Theo saw that the camera had drew her interest and smiled at her. Oh yes, I want the truth you hold, the truth about my brother, you demon. You will give your confession and it will be recorded for all to hear. Let's flash back to that kid you hardly knew. It took me a little bit, but I finally put it together. I knew you were there when my brother died. After our first meeting, I recognized your voice, and I knew you had to be my final offering. Wait, recognized my voice? We never talked before the job. Damn it! Untie me! The mechanic waited until Helen stopped struggling, too weak from blood loss to do much, and then continued. Maybe not to each other, Miss Graves. You do, however, talk a lot in every other kind of way possible. I find it funny that when my brother's belongings were returned, his cell phone was missing. Imagine that? Yeah, so? What? Helen already knew what he was talking about. She couldn't let him win this easily. Well, when my brother was shot in the head, he didn't just die. He was alive. But you knew that already, didn't you? A cold, evil stare came over the mechanic's eyes when he met Helen's defiant gaze. He then closed his eyes and shook his head violently as if he was shaking something out of his head. Theo seemed to re-emerge and continued to speak. Byron is full of shit. The cookie-cutter layout he gave in that painting was ridiculous, because in that version, he at least had a quick death, and he looked at peace. Well, here in the real world, he literally tried to call for help. You know who he called? Me. Theo jerked a thumb at his chest. He was breathing heavily, the memory still so fresh in his mind. I was just a kid, hearing my brother gurgling and gasping, and I was powerless. That fucking flip phone. Imagine if it would have been in today's age. He would have just had to hit a button for an emergency. Nope, not in our story. I remember when we were kids and he first got that phone. He was showing off the speed dial buttons. Well, lucky me, he picked the button that he assigned to me. I was the one that night who got to hear a murder happen. He shot himself, Helen protested. It wasn't murder. No, there you go again, lying. That's not the ending of our little story, is it? I kept listening to the sounds of him dying, and then finally I heard a voice on the other end saying, he was shot in the face, and what are we going to do? The mechanic shook his head, a sad expression on his face. I was hopeful after hearing the conversation. Someone was there to help. As an adult, I think about that moment, though, and realize that was all an act. The wanting to help. Theo kept pacing back and forth, arms crossed as he was reliving the moment. Then you didn't help, did you? I know for me, I was trying to yell to get someone's attention. My dad wasn't home and I thought I could get whoever it was on the other side of the phone to tell me what was happening. I heard someone grab the phone and I yelled out. But then I heard the plop as it was tossed into the water. Of course, then the call dropped. Theo stepped in close, holding the knife close to her eyes. So, demon, you knew my brother was alive. I heard you shush him. A boy with a bullet wound to the head, and you just wanted him to quiet down. I was just trying to comfort him, Ellen explained, attempting to finish her lie. No, don't you pull that with me here. You may have lied to the police, but you won't lie to me, and you cannot hide your sins from God. I didn't know what to do, Helen tried again, her voice weak. Please don't. Don't what, demon? Tell the world what the evil witch Scylla Ramshorn and her minions did in the name of the devil. Also, she could have her power. Scylla didn't know, Helen shouted, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know, damn it. They thought he was dead. Only I knew. Theo surged forward, grabbing the back of Helen's head with one hand and pulling the knife on her face with the other. Helen could smell the coppery scent of the blood and feel the cold metal blade of the knife against her lips as she whimpered. Keep lying, minion, and I'll cut your tongue out. He bent his head forward, whispering in her ear as if he had a secret to tell her. I'll leave it in a special place, only she will think to look for it, whore. Theo pulled away to stare into her eyes. May I? The mechanic attempted to get permission from his father. The groundskeeper trembled in the chair but didn't dare speak. She didn't know how long he kept the knife to her face. It could have been seconds or hours. Before he found an answer, Theo heard the music. It was the sound of her phone that made him finally back away, taking the knife with him. I'm bringing sexy back. Them other boys don't know how to act. Theo swayed his hips a little as he let the ringtone play. Picking up the phone and seeing the witch's face, he laughed. Oh, it looks like your witch wants to talk to you, Coven member. Helen looked at the phone, seeing Scylla's face. After a moment, the phone chimed and Theo grinned. Oh, I wonder what message your witch has for her loyal minion. Though judging by your little craft projects, it looks like you haven't been so loyal. Are you hoping that she will whip you? Theo laughed, mocking Helen and the ringtone she'd chosen for the witch. Helen didn't answer, though tears had begun to stream down her face. The mechanic approached her with the phone and put it in front of her face. The phone unlocked and he opened the voicemail app. In the small space, Helen thought Scylla's voice sounded like an angel. Helen, it's Scylla. I'm coming back to the mansion tonight. Give me a call when you get this." "Well, this is wonderful news. God had answered my prayers, and the witch will come to me. I promise to be just like you were with my brother. I'll be sure to stay with her to comfort her until the end. I think I'm going to go out for a little while and prepare for her arrival." "You stay." The mechanic held his hand up to the tied-up groundskeeper as if he was giving a command to a dog. Helen mumbled under her breath, "You fucking asshole. Don't hurt her." With a laugh, Theo opened the trap door and slammed it shut behind him as he exited the little room under the hothouse. After the second call did not yield an answer, Scylla left a voicemail as instructed. The brunette shot her brother a worried glance, and as Alder went over the assignments with various agents and local law enforcement, he looked at Scylla. "Maybe it's just interference from the storm," Byron offered, attempting to give Scylla some reassurance. "Maybe," Scylla answered, but she wasn't so sure. She couldn't help but sense that something was wrong with her friend. Beside them, Porter shrugged. "She could be high. I mean, the weather is crap. She doesn't know you're coming back. I can see her stoning the evening away." "Let's hope that's all she's doing," Byron said, wondering if it was possible that the groundskeeper really was the killer. Scylla looked at her brother and scoffed. "She's not what they think she is. She's just messed up. What happened to Clay fucked us all up." "I don't give a damn who you are. I said I'm going with you." Rael's voice, booming in the small conference room, drew everyone's attention, and Scylla made her way over to where the bodyguard stood. The blonde was facing Alder, and Tally stood partially between them. "What's going on?" Scylla asked. "Agent Alder seems to think that we will stay here while her team goes to the mansion." "Absolutely not," Scylla said. "It's my home. You can't keep me from going there." Alder's jaw clenched, and Tally lightly touched her arm. The agent turned her gaze on Tally, eyes only slightly softening. "Sarah, they can help." "They'll get in the way. It could put them at risk or a member of this team. I can't have that." "I can follow orders, Agent. I know how this goes. I've served with Tally. I know my weapons. I also know Helen and how she would maneuver because I taught her. You need me. You will also need the ram's horns if you want to navigate through that property. The storm has already made these lights flicker once since being here. It's only going to get worse," Rael said. Time wasn't on Agent Alder's side, and rather than continuing to waste precious time by arguing, she nodded. "Fine. You can cover the back exit. From what we can tell, if she's located in these possible locations, she will try to flee the closest exits. That back gate is too far away, so stay put. It will keep you out of the way and safe. If the others insist on coming with us, you take responsibility for them. I mean, their lives are in your hands. Do you understand?" Rael's jaw clenched, but she gave a curt nod. "Yes." "Let's go," Alder called out to the team. As they started filing out of the station and into the assigned vans, Rael and Scylla followed to the ones of the SUVs. Porter looked at the group leaving and back at Byron, who was playing on his phone. He grabbed his wrist and said, "Come on, we're leaving." Byron looked up. "Wait, why am I going?" "Man, this sucks." Porter looked back at his boyfriend with a scowl. "Okay, fine, I was kidding." Byron rolled his eyes as he followed Porter out of the station. Under his breath, he muttered, "Come on, let's go towards the psycho killer. Sounds fun." After Rael made sure that the civilians were loaded safely in the SUV, the bodyguard steps back into the moving sea of law enforcement. She spots Tally, and they exchange a knowing glance. In their minds, they are the only two they see. Their bond is stronger than ever at this moment. Rael gives a single nod, an unspoken message. With storm and fury. The redhead nods. "Let's end this today." Special Agent Craven steps up to her assigned vehicle, and their trance is broken. Rael, with a smile of appreciation and love, she yells out to Tally, "Stay safe. I'll see you after." Tally nods again, and Rael steps back to her own vehicle and climbs behind the wheel. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.